Introduction. Critique of Indigenous Reason. I define relative humanity as the belief that certain human beings, to the extent that they share a common religious, ethnic, cultural, or other similarly substantial identity attribute, lack one or more of the necessary attributes of being human, and are therefore human only in a relative sense, not absolutely, and not unequivocally. Omar Barghouti. Indigeneity has become constitutive of the Palestinian cause. Indigenous and Native American studies have opened a much needed grammar for recognition and redress in Palestine. To perceive Palestinians as the indigenous people of this contested land is already to overcome, or at least to push back against, the view that all Jews are the timeless victims of history, incapable of victimizing others. Foregrounding Palestinian indigeneity recasts Israeli Jews as dispossessors and settlers, those who have historically wronged Palestinians and still continue to do so under the brutal occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and in Israel proper. To claim Palestinian indigeneity is to respond directly to Israel's own claim of Jewish priority, to its connection to the land of milk and honey, to its ideological fantasy of continuous spatial and temporal presence on the Promised Land. It stubbornly affirms the antecedents of Palestinians' being and world, rejecting what we might call Israel's mythic nativity, its phantasmatic identity, deployed to legitimize and justify Palestinian dispossession on the grounds that it is Israel's ontological entitlement, its right to inhabit the Holy Land, the land of Judea and Samaria, as described in Scripture. In Saïdian parlance, Jewish indigeneity is divine or metaphysical. It appeals to origins, as in the narrative of Israeli manifest destiny, whereas Palestinian indigeneity is historical or worldly, dealing rather with beginnings. The former dreams of transcendence and redemption, the latter is born of contingency and resilience. At the same time, in a global context marked by liberal democratic ideology, formulating Palestinian identity in terms of indigeneity tends to confine it, to fix it at the level of culture. It effectively risks casting the Palestinian dilemma exclusively as a problem of cultural management. Casting indigenous Palestinians as a cultural minority in Israel leads to calls to protect, preserve, and accommodate the Palestinian way of life. Israel ought to be more tolerant, and so on. This approach campaigns against an apartheid Israel and in favor of civic justice, a more democratic state capable of including cultural minorities without fundamentally altering its framework. When indigeneity is construed instead as intimately linked to questions of land and sovereignty, Palestinians can be thought as a majority surrounded by hostile settlers and Israeli occupation forces in the West Bank, reduced to dwelling in the world's largest open-air prison in Gaza. In this framework, Palestinian lives can be conceived as mattering and deserving of the same right to self-determination. Yet, this tack leads to calls for national independence and collective sovereignty, typically and problematically embodied in the two-state solution. The Western nation-state framework lives on in this model, and indigeneity is reappropriated, neutralized, and translated into preconceived notions of racial separatism, neatly aligning Jews and Arabs with their respective nations. Solidarity and the Palestinian cause insist that any analysis of indigenity's purchase must keep this problem of translation in mind and consider what an appeal to indigeneity means for those within Palestinian themselves and their competing claims, and what it signifies to those without, most particularly Western political powers. Do these align, or is there friction? What gets eclipsed when the idea of indigeneity travels, when its audience is liberal multiculturalists who desperately hunger for the imago of indigeneity, eager to save the endangered Palestinians, is precisely the question of politics. When the demand for stolen land is surpassed by arguments foregrounding the recognition of Palestinian rights allocated by the Israeli nation-state, what then are the counter-politics of indigeneity? When does the culturalization of indigeneity empower the colonized? And when does it lead to a suspension of politics, understood as, quote, the space of litigation in which the excluded can protest the wrong or injustice done to them, unquote? Does indigeneity become a form of identity category through which Palestinians are able to make political demands and declare their desire for collective self determination? Does privileging indigeneity lock Palestinians in their particularity, obscuring the universality of the Palestinian cause? Is indigenous reason, the interminable thinking, desiring, or interpreting what is deemed indigenous, capable of inciting revolutionary change, of dismantling the master's or settler's house? This book takes this last question to heart, considering especially how this plea is misheard by liberal Zionists and Western powers who want to save Israel from itself, to protect its democracy from the state's increasingly racial and racist policies without ever questioning the idea or ideal of a Jewish state. And yet, rejecting the nation state can lead all too easily into the traps of pristine time before the settler, to the commitment of reviving a Palestine prior to the Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948, protected from the wounds and ravages of colonialism. Against this understanding of indigenous insularity, this book puts Palestinian indigeneity in dialogue with critical black studies as a way to meditate on the full force and concrete provocations of the Chilean precept, another end of the world is possible. Otro fin del mundo es posible. We ask, how does Palestinian indigeneity relate and speak to current global reactions to racial injustice fueled in large part by the Black Lives Matter movement? Isn't an emancipatory movement worthy of its name not predicated upon interrogating indigeneity and its complicity with anti-blackness? Are struggles against settler colonialism and anti-blackness incommensurable, prone to distortion, confusion, and instrumentalization? Or, if we choose, as I believe we should, not to condemn these cross-racial efforts in advance, might they foster acts of solidarity, be imagined as constitutive of a new global anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist left that avoids the separatist temptation, isolating tribal interests and fetishizing particularism, and the elimination of difference, the claim that all subjugations are the same? If so, how does indigeneity with blackness signal a struggle not only against cultural domination, anti-blackness, Islamophobia, neo-Orientalism, etc., but also against economic exploitation, the instrumentalization of human life, and the naturalization of neoliberal values? How does this emergent global demand for racial and economic justice recast and retrieve indigeneity and the question of Palestine anew as a universal cause? Wither indigeneity. The signifier indigenous is part and parcel of a general logic of othering the colonized, the native of the land. Countering this logic, decolonial thinker Walter Mignolo ingeniously turns the table on the colonizers by applying the signifier to them, European indigenous peoples. Mignolo dispels the strangeness of saying Europeans are indigenous, observing, quote, "You will find that the word is an adjective referring to those born or originating in a particular place. It comes from the Latin indigenous, which means born in a country, native. So if Europeans are not indigenous, where did they come from?" Unquote. This move is intended to question the universalism and epistemic superiority of the Western subject and its alignment with civilization and the privileges of culture. It denaturalizes the Europeans' naturalization of their heroic overcoming of nature, reframing the Western subject as irremediably marked by its positionality and geography. Europeans are not born exemplars of humanity and civilization. They ideologically and phantasmatically become them. In other words, there is nothing ontologically special about the being of Europeans. While in support of the desire to demystify European exceptionalism, Anishinaabe curator Wanda Nanibush, in her dialogue with Mignolo, cautions against such blanket deployments of the term. Asserting "we are all indigenous" misses something. Nanibush draws attention to the position of the enunciation, to the one who utters the word. Quote, "I think our difference is that I use words after recentering Anishinaabe ways of being and thinking, rather than from within a critique of Eurocentrism. Yes, you are right that the dictionary definition does in fact mean that to somewhere everyone is indigenous. It is also true that indigenous is a word not of our own creation, much like most geopolitical markers in the world today. However, I did not appropriate indigenous. Instead, I use indigenous. Indigenous with a capital I is about sovereignty movements, land rights, the rights of the earth, return to indigenous women's role in our societies, and much more dreaming that cannot be contained in a policy document. It seems there are differences we name with the word indigenous that is not part of the European definition and that create breaks in a colonial framework. Unquote. Indigenous at once indexes people who preceded the colonial encounter and emerges as a response to that encounter. Indigeneity is an invention and a process, a form of becoming, rather than a mere product of settler colonialism. If Europeans effaced their own indigeneity when they subjected the non-European inhabitants of the land to a racialized mode of classification, Mignolo, the same subalternized non-Europeans are now speaking and writing back, reimagining indigeneity on their own terms, absent humanitarian intervention, altering or rather politicizing what it means to be indigenous. Nanibush. Such is the case of the native Palestinians. Settler colonialism, not unlike slavery, is not a historical relic. It has a thriving afterlife. Indigenous identities across the globe bear the ontological marks of their dreadful encounter with European settlers. As Edward Cavanagh and Lorenzo Veracini observe, an analysis of settler colonialism that does justice to its complexities must adopt a disjunctive temporality and grasp this global and transnational phenomenon at its beginnings and its current forms. Quote, as much a thing of the past as a thing of the present, unquote. Like other settler colonial projects, Zionism is not primarily about the exploitation of Palestinians, what would be expected under colonialism, but their elimination. The target is not indigenous labor, but native land. Unlike European colonization, Sayegh argued in 1965, the Zionist colonization of Palestine was essentially incompatible with the continued existence of the native population in the coveted country. Unquote. Under Zionism, settler colonialism took the most brutal form. Quote, if racial discrimination against the inferior natives was the motto of race supremacist European settled regimes in Asia and Africa, the motto of the race supremacist Zionist settler regime in Palestine was racial elimination. Unquote. The Zionist settler did not seek the natives' exploitation. You work for me. He sought her disappearance. You go away. In its inception, then, Zionism equated territory with national sovereignty, and thus created the indigenous inhabitants of the land as a problem, an existential obstacle for the realization of its people. Claiming Palestinian indigeneity jams the settlers' ongoing discursive and epistemic domestication of the native, the project of rendering the indigenous docile and inexistent. Existence is resistance. It thwarts the settler's playbook, the Zionist desire to Judaize Palestinian land, to naturalize dispossession and the removal of the indigenous inhabitants, to implement racist housing policies and accelerate home demolitions, and of course to aggressively pursue the extraction of natural resources. Claiming Palestinian indigeneity also points to something unassimilable, residing outside Israel's web of imperial knowledge. Read through the prism of settler colonialism, 1948 Arabs, Israeli Palestinians are Nakba survivors. This designation linguistically registers both the historical trauma of the settler conquest, its profound epistemic ontological cosmological violence, as Eve Tuck and Wayne Young put it, and the persistence of Palestinians, their refusal to disappear. Quote, the presence of indigenous peoples, who make a priori claims to land and ways of being, is a constant reminder that the settler colonial project is incomplete, unquote. Indigeneity evokes not only the people's prior existence to the land, Palestinians were here first, it also denaturalizes the political scene, insisting, as Mark Rifkin points out, on the necessity to, quote, interrogate the legitimacy of the legal and administrative frameworks of the settler state while also attending to the presence and contours of actual or aspirational political formations by indigenous peoples, unquote. Palestinian indigeneity is clearly a problem for settler Zionism, an affront to it, a remainder and reminder of Israel's failed eliminative project. Palestinians are still struggling against the occupation, and the rest of the world is waking up to the justice of their cause. At stake here are two narratives of what we might call indigenous reason, after Achille Mbembe's notion and treatment of black reason. Quote, Black reason names not only a collection of discourses, but also practices, the daily work that consisted in inventing, telling, repeating, and creating variations on the formulas, texts, and rituals whose goal was to produce the black man as a racial subject and site of savage exteriority, who was therefore set up for moral disqualification and practical instrumentalization. We can call this founding narrative the Western consciousness of blackness. In seeking to answer the question, who is he, the narrative seeks to name a reality exterior to it and to situate that reality in relationship to an I considered to be the center of all meaning. From this perspective, anything that is not identical to that I is abnormal. Let us call this second narrative the black consciousness of blackness. It nevertheless had its own characteristics, literary, biographical, historical, and political. It was the product of a polyglot internationalism. It was born in the great cities of the United States and the Caribbean, then in Europe and later in Africa. Ideas circulated within a vast global network, producing the modern black imaginary. Unquote. Indigenous reason similarly establishes two diametrically opposed attitudes to settler colonialism. The first narrative of indigenous reason serves as settler colonialism's raison d'etre, essentializing and hierarchizing both the settler and the native. The latter's land is the former's manifest destiny. This indigenous reason is constituted from the outside. Indigenous reason degrades native lives. It produces a biased ontology that hierarchizes the being of the settler above that of the native and the enslaved. Quote, the settler positions himself as both superior and normal. The settler is natural, whereas the indigenous inhabitant and the chattel slave are unnatural, even supernatural. Unquote. Indigenous reason expels Palestinian indigeneity from the designation human. In this narrative, the native is an artifact of settler colonialism and Zionist ideology. You are not born native, you become racialized as one. This indigenous reason is a settler colonial reason obsessed with neutralizing, killing the native. It celebrates Israel's racial and ethnic domination over the indigenous population, while proclaiming the latter's mental and moral inferiority. They are rendered primitive, unreliable, wicked, suspicious, and dangerous. What we have here is the Zionist consciousness of Palestinian indigeneity. The second narrative posits indigenous reason as self-constituting. It reappropriates and rearticulates indigenous reason as the consciousness of the harrowing experiences that have forged indigenous identities across the globe from 1492 to the present, of all the native peoples who have been and continue to be touched by the machinery of settler colonialism. In the case of Palestine-Israel, it questions settler ontology, Jewish exceptionalism, and seeks colonialism's demise by reinventing and reviving indigenous modes of being. This is Palestinian consciousness of Palestinian indigeneity. This consciousness emanates from Palestinians in the occupied territories, in Israel proper, and from the diaspora. Needless to say, the narratives of Palestinian indigeneity that such a consciousness produces are marked, dismissed, and or criminalized as anti-Semitic by the Israeli settler state and its staunch Western supporters. In both instances, indigenous reason, for consistency and because they are entangled, I capitalize indigenous in referring to both modes, names an array of discourses and practices invested in peoples whose relation to the land is in question or an object of concern. Indigenous reason is also a hermeneutic. It interprets the autochthonous, the native, as either given or a colonialist construction. Anti-colonial theory has long attended to the latter and cautioned against accepting the colonizer's terms or hegemonic script. Self-endowed with the power to name and categorize, the colonizer, after all, does not so much discover indigenous people as fix and narrate them. Imperialism is the export of identity, as Edward Said succinctly put it. Western powers project an identity, an ontology, onto indigenous populations, simultaneously essentializing them and producing knowledge about these non-Europeans. In the case of Palestinians, What is produced by the settler is paradoxically a knowledge of their non being, of their status as a non people. The concept of terra nullius, a land of no one, an 18th century legal notion deployed to authorize the European expropriation of indigenous peoples' lands, plays a crucial role in the production of this knowledge. Indigenous reason conceives of the native as primitive, deceitful, and a pest to eliminate. Claiming Palestinian indigeneity foregrounds Palestinian consciousness of Palestinian indigeneity. It puts the settler colonial framework front and center in the discussion of Palestine, countering two major objections to its use by critics keen to question its rhetorical utility and accuracy. First, that the evocation of settler colonialism hardens the will of your interlocutors, alienating those whom you're trying to convince, and open up to the Palestinian question, a version of nobody likes to be called a racist. And second, that no one actually believed in terra nullius. Jewish settlers knew that Palestinians lived on the disputed land. The first reproach smacks of bad faith. It represents a betrayal of integrity and conscience. The theft of land and freedom is sidestepped in favor of accommodating the sensibilities of the oppressor's settlers and their supporters who would be disturbed or vexed by any queries into Zionism's colonial ambitions then and now. The second rendering of the situation simplifies the affective and ideological appeal of terra nullius, downplaying the fetishist disavowal of the early settlers. They knew very well that Palestinians live on this land, but they didn't believe it. By, quote, by emptying the other from the head of the colonizer, unquote, Zionism mythically desubstantializes Palestinian presence, then and now, treating the inhabitants as if they came from elsewhere, making them Arab outsiders, provisionally occupying the land until its true inhabitants returned. Zionism's epistemic classification of Arabs as indigenous, unlike the true indigeneity of the chosen people, was and is meant to facilitate their subjugation, control, and liquidation. In historic Palestine and modern Israel, Palestinians, Arabs remain brute nomadic trespassers on their own land, and poor in world in Heideggerian parlance, whereas Jewish settlers are white, Western, and world-forming. Edward Said's Orientalism helps to trace the becoming white colonial of the Jewish people to the emergence of the late 19th century Zionist movement in Europe and the splitting of the figure of the Semite. Quote, by a concatenation of events and circumstances, the Semitic myth bifurcated in the Zionist movement. One Semite went the way of Orientalism, the other, the Arab, was forced to go the way of the Oriental. Unquote. Post-Second World War, Western powers and Zionists worked in tandem. The former wanted Jews out of Europe, viewing their loyalty as a constant source of suspicion, and the latter wanted Jews in their own homeland, believing that only a Jewish nation could counteract the degeneration, the ontological effects of alienated existence in Europe that Jews were experiencing. The founding of Israel became the preferred Zionist solution. European anti-Semitism, reaching its apogee in the Shoah, provided the socio-political conditions for the Zionists' pitch to their fellow Jews and the rest of the world. In preparing the grounds for a future Jewish state in Palestine, Zionist leaders eagerly formulated their understanding of Jewish belonging around the fetish of the modern European nation-state. By successfully exporting the nation-state to Palestine and committing to the notion of its superior values and racial matrix, one nation, one state, political Zionism not only phantasmatically whitened Jews, but more important, racialized Palestinians as non-white, permanent non-nationals of the land. Israel's 2018 nation-state law confirmed this vision, making it abundantly clear that the right to exercise national self-determination is unique to the Jewish people. In ascending to whiteness, Zionist settlers depicted the indigenous population as wild animals, devoid of any moral worth, which in turn facilitated their killing, dispossession, and mass expulsion, the well-trodden path of settler colonialism. Long self-promoted as a beacon of civilization, ever since Theodor Herzl, the father of Zionism, strategically framed the Jewish state as, quote, a part of a wall of defense for Europe in Asia, an outpost of civilization against barbarism, unquote. Israeli leaders have continued to remind the Western world that Israel constitutes their protective wall from fanatic Arabs, faithfully securing and serving the geopolitical interests of its unwavering imperial sponsors, namely the United States and England. Israel stood and still stands as a villa in the middle of a jungle, in the memorable but shamelessly self serving words of the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. But as with Orientalism, it is crucial to note that the knowledge that indigenous reason produces has less to do with Palestine and Palestinians than it does with the Western world. Its knowledge, let's say, about the Arab mind, is indeed a kind of Western projection, marked by the knower subject's own anxieties, insecurities, and vulnerabilities. The Zionist perspective, of course, also supplements and mediates the West's already expansive colonial Orientalist imaginary, thus compounding the ideological distortions of Palestinian life and ways of being. Simply put, indigenous reason and its proliferations of racist and Orientalist tropes about the natives always tells us more about the knower than the known, the narrator than the narrated, the colonizer than the colonized. Deeply enmeshed in necropower, indigenous reason produces and rationalizes the racial divide between the West and the rest. Achille Mbembe moves to unsettle this divide by provincializing Giorgio Agamben's Eurocentric grammar of suffering, laid out in his analysis of the Holocaust as the ultimate paradigm for exceptional violence and the making of bare life. Though following Agamben in maintaining that sovereign power exists in the capacity to eradicate political existence, to strip individuals of their legal rights, for instance, reducing life to biological existence, Mbembe, not unlike Hannah Arendt and Aimé Césaire before him, supplements or enlarges the analytical scope of biopolitics by looking at European colonialism and racial slavery. In this context, European colonial sovereignty takes from the start a different form. It is not enough to say that biopolitics takes a turn for the worse when the state of exception starts to become the rule. The notion of biopower, Mbembe writes, quote, does not suffice to account for the contemporary ways in which the political, under the disguise of war, of resistance, or of fights against terror, makes the murder of its enemy its primary and absolute objective, unquote. A biopolitical investment in all lives, in the regulation and expansion of life as such, is utterly foreign to the settler colonial project. There's a necropolitics at the core of settler colonialism. The settler state does not manage death for the sake of life. Rather, settler sovereignty is constitutively necropolitical. Necropolitics in the colony is after, quote, the generalized instrumentalization of human existence and the material destruction of human bodies and populations, unquote. It quickly becomes clear, however, that colonial experimentation or variation in biopolitics is not a feature of the past, as if chattel slavery and the genocidal conquest of the New World were only a couple of dark episodes in European modernity, mere hiccups in the teleological march of progress. The legacy of European colonial sovereignty persists, and it is fully visible in Palestine-Israel. Quote, the contemporary colonial occupation of Palestine, unquote, testifies to the singular entanglement of the disciplinary, the disciplining of bodies, the biopolitical, the regulating of bodies, and the necropolitical, the destroying of bodies. There and elsewhere, Mbembe unearths a sovereign logic characteristic of late modern colonial occupation, at work in seizing, delimiting, and asserting control over a physical geographical area, of writing on the ground a new set of social and spatial relations. Colonial sovereignty, Mbembe claims further, defines who matters and who does not, who is disposable and who is not, unquote. We can reformulate Mbembe's observation about necropower in the colony in terms of the paradigm of immunology. Lives that matter are immunized from the racialized other, purified and nourished, while those that don't are contaminated, left exposed and impoverished at best, and at worst judged as securitization problem and thus marked for destruction or debilitation. Necropolitical sovereignty introduces a firm hierarchy of lives/races. Its use of biopower is destructive rather than productive. Indigenous reason does the bidding of the sovereign settler who decides which lives are worthy of immunization and protection and which ones are neglected and left vulnerable. Israel's decision to put Gaza on a diet reflects the state's necropolitical logic at work in managing Palestinian indigeneity. Counting calories in order to avoid a disaster constitutes for Nadia Abu el-Hajj, quote, the calculus of Israel's necropolitical regime, unquote. At its most basic level, then, immunizing life in the colony is first and foremost a racist technology of domination. Its racial calculus solidifies itself as it purifies it from any unwanted excess, from any exposure to undesirable racial foreignness. The Jewish state must be defended. If starving the enemy is not an option, a humanitarian crisis would trigger too much attention from Western powers and media, then psychically and physically weakening her through a cruel diet, one that keeps the native alive only to better contain her, becomes the settler's preferred alternative. Under the quasi-speciesist horizon of Zionism, Jewish life enjoys the security and pleasures of national citizenship, whereas Palestinian life is racialized, made to reside in a third zone between subjecthood and objecthood, figured as a savage life, that is, just another form of animal life. Settling the human or the unmattering of Palestinians. Indigenous reason divides land, erects racial classifications, and disciplines Palestinian indigeneity. Palestinians are deemed in but not of the human world. They arouse a mixture of fear and disgust in the Zionist settlers. Their sheer presence is an existential threat and an offense to these settlers' demographic advantage and exclusive right to belong. In the Zionist order of things, for Jewish life to matter, Palestinian life must unmatter. An unmattered life here is clearly not one that enjoys all of the privileges of being human white, but neither is it a life that simply doesn't matter, the lot of not humans, of those who lie outside humanity, subject to human neglect or indifference. Rather, it is a life haunted by an anterior self, whose life would have presumably mattered if circumstances were different, whose humanity has been ontologically undone or negated, the source of uncare, rendered inhuman or faceless, the fruits of a cruel and racist assemblage. An unmattered life bears the traces of its ripped subjectivity, congealed in a fixed order, racialized to the point of monstrosity, animality, and condemned to death in life. If humanity is a racial signifier, as Denise Ferreira da Silva points out, the Zionist settlers' message to the West is clear. Don't be fooled by their appearance. Palestinians aren't like us, white, human. They are intrinsically wicked and cannot be trusted. They are more animal than human. Don't blame us for taking strong, disproportionate measures for defending Jewish collectivity. We are only defending Israel and, as the West, from the inhuman Arab next door. Settler ideology predicts a set future, a reproduction of the status quo. It espouses a heartless futurology, which, as Slavoj Žižek defines it, is a systematic forecasting of the future from the present trends in society. And therein resides the problem. Futurology mostly extrapolates what will come from the present tendencies. Unquote. Zionist futurology is driven by Manichaean logic. Jews and Palestinians are stuck in implacable positions, foreclosing the possibilities of historical miracles, radical breaks which can only be explained retroactively once they happen. Futurology is the settler's temporality of choice. It normalizes what's to come, projecting a foreseeable future. More Zionist expansion, more Palestinian dispossession. Israel's political decisions are effectively depoliticized by making them appear predictable, even necessary, rather than the result of callous deliberation. Why? It is the fixed being of Palestinians that dictates Israeli doing. Indigenous reason denies the anti-colonial frame for reading the Palestinian struggle, replacing it with an anti-Semitic one, ruling out armed struggle as a legitimate mode of resistance against the illegal occupation. For the settlers, Palestinians are bloodthirsty terrorists. Anti-Semitism is in their cultural DNA. They refuse to recognize Israel's right to exist, since a Jewish state would entail no Palestinian right of return, guaranteeing a demographic advantage for Jews. They embrace a culture of death, displaying no care for life or for the innocent. Israel claims that it can only react, lamenting how the Jewish people lack a genuine peace partner. There is no Palestinian Gandhi or Mandela to put an end to the conflict. This is an instance of Israeli hasbara, a term meaning explanation and used euphemistically in Hebrew to refer to propaganda, a rhetorical performance for its Western audience. If Palestinians had opted for nonviolence in their pursuit of national sovereignty, goes this line of thought, then things would have unfolded differently. Conservative columnists peddled this narrative wholesale. The late Charles Krauthammer, for example, lamented Palestinians' unwillingness to make peace with Israel. Quote, Israel wanted nothing more than to live in peace with this independent Palestinian entity. After all, the world had incessantly demanded that Israel give up land for peace. It gave the land. It got no peace. The Gaza Palestinians did not reciprocate. They voted in Hamas, who then took over in a military putsch and turned their newly freed Palestine into an armed camp from which to war against Israel. It has been war ever since. Unquote. Brett Stevens similarly reads the current situation as one of Arabs' own doing. Quote, nearly every time the Arab side said no, it wound up with less. It was true in 2000 when Syria rejected an Israeli offer to return the Golan Heights, which ultimately led to US recognition of Israeli sovereignty of that territory. It was true later the same year, after Yasser Arafat refused Israelis' offer of a Palestinian state with a capital in East Jerusalem, which led to 2 decades of terrorism, Palestinian civil war, the collapse of the Israeli peace camp, and the situation we have now. Unquote. This Arab-blaming narrative abstracts and dehistoricizes Palestinians, removing them from their environment and the settler colonial context. The impact of occupation on their being and psyche is irrelevant or of no concern. Moreover, it is as if Israel is offering or giving up land out of generosity and not because it is in violation of international law and illegally occupying Palestinian territory. And yet, this ideological narrative resonates with Western liberals. Progressive counter-narratives reframing the discussions from a Palestinian perspective have yet to gain wide circulation and traction, while those dubbed progressives, except for Palestine, PEP, go with the flow. American politicians on both sides of the aisle repeatedly affirm the unbreakable bond between Israel and the United States and mechanically insist on Israel's right to defend itself, equals its right to remain an illegal occupying force. Aping Israel's talking points about security, or its land grab, the move of the US embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, which constituted a slap in the face of Palestinians, was also overwhelmingly supported by both Democrats and Republicans. Then Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer even personally applauded Donald Trump for his decision. Given this widespread pro-Israel sentiment, the Palestinian blaming narrative offers a superficial explanation for the deadlock. The recourse to violence indicates that Palestinians aren't really interested in peace with Israel, and an excuse for doing nothing about it. Settler ideology, which converts anti-colonial resistance into anti-Semitic hate, is thus in the business of keeping the possible possible and the impossible impossible. The political projects of a free Palestine and a decolonized Israel are excised from the Western Zionist political imaginary. Futurology points to more occupation, more annexation, and a looming Greater Israel that is a racist one-state solution under the nervous eyes of a liberal West, still delusionally invested in a two-state solution, one that recognized the national yearnings of both peoples. But when all Palestinians are increasingly tagged as enemies, we are, for example, told by the Israeli Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman that there are no innocent people in the Gaza Strip, political myopia unavoidably sets in. Western-backed solutions to the Palestinian problem, which de facto require as a precondition Israel's approval to move forward, narrow significantly. Settler ideology not only fixes the identity of its indigenous population, it's also responsible for their racialized creation as non-white and inhuman because non-white. Many Zionist settlers brought with them to historic Palestine a Western metaphysics that conditioned, if not overdetermined, their encounter with the native inhabitants. Of course, not all Zionists adopted an exclusionary stance in relation to the land, though the majority never questioned the biases shaping the project of settler colonialism as a civilizing mission, bringing culture and modern knowledge to savages and backward people, nor doubted the virtuous character of settlement and expansion, even displaying a Lockean enthusiasm for working the land and realizing God's plan. Some early Zionists, like Martin Buber, favored cultural Zionism and urged cooperation and coexistence with their Arab neighbors. But it would be an understatement to say that cultural Zionists lost the struggle over the meaning of Zionism after the creation of Israel in 1948. With the 1967 Six-Day War, political Zionism cemented its authority and its control over the signifier Jew, naturalizing the identification of Jewishness with the State of Israel. The implications of this move are chillingly clear. A critique of Israel is a critique of the Jewish people and is thus anti Semitic, or, if uttered by a Jewish dissenter, pathological or self hating. According to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA, claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor qualifies as an instance of anti Semitism. Questioning Israel's status as a settler state is tantamount to questioning the legitimacy of the Jewish people and casting all Jews as oppressors. Along with this ideological naturalization of Jewishness, political Zionism invested its efforts in producing the Arab of the land as otherwise than human. In this respect, indigenous reason fulfills the agenda of political Zionism. Zionist consciousness of Palestinian indigeneity traffics in what Alexander Wahilia dubs racializing assemblages. Expanding the ways we imagine race, Wahilia stresses how this elusive signifier is neither a biological nor cultural taxonomy, but operates as a set of socio-political processes that discipline humanity into full humans, not quite humans, and non-humans. After Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, assemblages are thought of as provisional, contingent associations of human and non-human entities. Assemblages follow an anti-identitarian logic. Nothing could be more foreign to assemblage thinking than the essentialization of bodies or objects. Indeed, assemblages deprivilege the human body as a discrete organic thing, writes Jasper Puar. Assemblages foreground complexity and process, drawing their agentic capacity from the vitality of the materialities that constitute it. If assemblages are, in principle, unfinished and unstable bodies, always ontologically open to transformation and reconfiguration, racializing assemblages produce bodies in order to keep them in their proper place, divested of mobility and fluidity. Quote, in the context of the secular human, black subjects, along with indigenous populations, the colonized, the insane, the poor, the disabled, and so on, serve as limit cases by which man can demarcate himself as the universal human. Thus, race, rather than representing difference, comes to define the very essence of the modern human as the code through which one not simply knows what human being is, but experiences being. Unquote. The purpose of racializing assemblages is to differentiate, hierarchize, and include-exclude. In Zionism's socio-spatial order, racializing assemblages frame the Palestinian native corporeality as the other of the human white settler, assigning full symbolic and material value to the latter while denying it to the former. Zionist settler consciousness inscribes the figure of the Palestinian in its racial theater, the space of systematic stigmatization. Palestinians have been thingified as rocks of Judea, Israeli President Chaim Weizmann says, but the stigma of choice is clearly animalization, the making of the natives into another species. Israeli political and military leaders have, for example, described Palestinians as beasts walking on two legs, Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, drugged cockroaches in a bottle, General Raphael Eitan, human animals, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, or snakes, Justice Minister Ayelet Shaked, to be eradicated or driven out from the Holy Land. David Theo Goldberg sums up succinctly the portrayal of the Palestinian problem as one of foreign infestation. Palestinians have been increasingly animated as snakes in tunnels, squirming their way into Israel to carry out terroristic plots, or as insects crawling across the landscape. They are deemed maggots, cockroaches, and vermin out to infect Israel's body politic, a decaying rot eating at the nation's democratic social fabric. Unquote. What is Israel to do? How do you deal with infestation? Violently, with extermination on the table. This racist imaginary is also gendered, and the bestialization of Palestinian bodies commingles with the feminization of their collective body. During Operation Protective Edge, the 2014 Israel-Gaza war, the patriarchal side of settler ideology was on full display. In a post addressed to Prime Minister Netanyahu that reached a broad audience on Israeli social media, we see a veiled woman labeled Gaza, naked from the waist down, holding a message: Bibi, finish inside this time. Signed, Citizens in Favor of a Ground Assault. The massacre of Palestinians is phantasmatically transfigured into a violent, sexualized spectacle akin to a snuff film. Hypermasculinization symbolizes the humanity of the Israeli Jew, while the less than human Palestinian is objectified, reduced to violable flesh, awaiting military intervention and domination. In this collective rape fantasy, Gazans are ventriloquized, obscenely cast as willing participants in their own violation, elimination, starring Benjamin Netanyahu as the rapist in chief. Zionist settler consciousness at once mystifies and simplifies the relationship between Jew and non-Jew. Whereas Jews are made to stand exclusively for the human, non-Jews are consigned to the categories of the not quite humans, the second-class Palestinian citizens of Israel, and the non-humans, the Palestinians of the West Bank and Gaza, the eternal enemies. The coherence of Zionist identity is predicated on the undoing or unmattering of Palestinian humanity, on relativizing it, producing what Omar Barghouti dubs relative humans, but those who are deemed human only in a relative sense, not absolutely and not unequivocally, alien in their own homeland and undeserving of the protection and privileges of Jewish nationality. Zionist reason precludes indigenous entry into the privileged orbit of the human. The Palestinian is said to exemplify the Zionist antithesis, the not quite human at best, the non-human at worst. Forever relativized, Palestinian humanity is never more than a remote possibility. Infinitely caught between the taxonomies of not quite human and non-human, Palestinians are overdetermined not to count, while Israeli Jews know they matter, enjoying the absolute certainty and coherence of their humanity. Are the differences between humans, not quite humans, and non-humans bridgeable? Can racial becoming be halted and redirected? Can racist assemblages be undone and resignified? Is a reassemblage of Palestinianness possible? If so, what would it take, and what would it look like? We can start by interrogating the difference between the Palestinians in the occupied territories and Israel proper. Let's imagine a hypothetical scenario in which a liberal Zionist government has been elected on a platform advocating kinder treatment of the Palestinian people. We could get a suspension of the long-running blockade of the Gaza Gulag, an expansion of cultural rights over religious sites in Jerusalem, a release of political prisoners, an increase in the political sovereignty of the Palestinian Authority over the West Bank, and even a decriminalization of Nakba Day, the commemoration of Palestinian dispossession. All of these overtures would surely bridge the gap between the two Palestinian groups, but it would be mere window dressing, leaving untouched the Zionist settler belief in the depraved inhumanity of all Palestinians. Again, it is the being of the natives that is the threat, not what they do. If the latter actions are changeable, if, for instance, an atmosphere of trust and collaboration ever sets in between Arab Palestinians and Jewish Israelis, the former is not. To subscribe to this vision of indigenous ontology is to condemn Palestinians to a death world, to a Zionist world that defines life as Jewish, white, against what it is not, Palestinian. Raising Palestinian lives to the standard of Israeli Palestinians might seem like a breakthrough, or at least progress, to a Western liberal audience, but these ontical upgrades would do little to disrupt what Sylvia Wynter calls the genre of the human. In Palestine Israel, the genre of the human, what constitutes the human as such, is captured by the Israeli Jew, or more precisely, the Ashkenazi, or European-born Jew, who overrepresents itself as if it were the human itself. A one mode of being human mentality invariably breeds an apartheid logic, a segregationist attitude, a walling off the Jew from the non Jew. Indigenous reason aligns Jewishness with the Enlightenment, with humanity and civilization. Within this Eurocentric regime of the human, Zionist settlers stand as the self appointed representative of the West whiteness in the jungle of the Middle East. And the corollary, indigenous reason aligns Palestinianness with an innate inhumanity savagery, splitting the Palestinian from the human. Palestinian stand for what is other than civilization. To be Palestinian Arab, indigenous reason dictates, is to be plagued by an alien propensity for violence. Indeed, the core of Palestinian subjectivity is always already traversed by an inhuman excess, a radical extremism, so that bloodlust is not a deviation from their character or exception to it, but rather signals a predilection for cruelty and hate, making anti Semitism integral to being Palestinian. The inhuman Arab neighbor must be contained, controlled, and dealt with, and, as in the rape imagery above, is fantasized as asking for it. Palestinophobia stems in part from the disfiguration of the Palestinian as bloodthirsty, the terrorist par excellence. The image of the Palestinian as terrorist was, of course, only exacerbated and amplified to the point of becoming a fully naturalized Arab stereotype in the righteous global war on terror. Israel all too easily adopted the US playbook on terrorism, which becomes another word for savagery and nihilism, for the negation of the West and everything it ostensibly stands for: freedom, democracy, and the American way. A safe Palestinian is a debilitated Palestinian, to adapt a genocidal saying from the Western frontier. We ought to keep in mind here Walter Benjamin's poignant remark: every document of civilization is also a document of barbarism. Anti Palestinian prejudice, then, is not some regrettable or embarrassing attitude of a few racist Israelis, but a foundational and permanent feature of Israeli normativity. Palestinophobia is constitutive of so called Zionist civilization. The Zionist settler state remains always already obsessed with the opposition between Jew and non Jew. Racial self segregation, racial exclusiveness, and racial supremacy constitute the core of the Zionist ideology. And yet the state does on occasion register and admonish the inhuman, inhumane treatment of Palestinians by the IDF or police. Take, for example, the fatal shooting of Ayad Halak, an unarmed 32-year-old autistic Palestinian man, by an Israeli border police officer on his way to the special needs school that he attended in the old city of East Jerusalem on May 30, 2020. The event produced national and international outrage, forcing Netanyahu to make a statement. What happened with the Halak family with Ayad Halak is a tragedy. A person with disabilities, with autism, who was suspected, we now know unjustly, of being a terrorist, isn't. Let me do that again. A person with disabilities, with autism, who has suspected, we now know unjustly, of being a terrorist in a very sensitive place. We all share in the grief of the family. Unquote. Netanyahu performed the semblance of accountability, signaling that an error was committed. The officer's suspicion of terrorism was not borne out, while also implying that the significance of the location, East Jerusalem, accounted for the officer's tragic overreaction to the situation. Clearly wanting to avoid a George Floyd-scale response to this unlawful killing, Israeli prosecutors, who typically look the other way, charged the border officer with reckless manslaughter. Will Halak and his family receive justice? It is unlikely, since the charge of reckless manslaughter already pales in front of what seems to have been a callous execution. Does the Halak example pose a problem for indigenous reason? Yes and no. The event put on display Israel's collective fantasies of Palestinians as phobic objects. The benign Halak gave the lie to Zionist consciousness of Palestinian indigeneity. The fallout is potentially immense. Israel's legitimacy is at stake. The legitimacy of any state for its people and the world at large lies in its capacity to administer the law justly. With Halak, the world witnessed the Israeli police as an agent of injustice. When representatives of law commit crimes in their very enforcement of the rule of law, writes Zizek, The rule of law is not just weakened, but undermined from within. It, it directly appears as its own self negation. Unquote. This legitimacy crisis is, however, recuperated and given an ideological spin. Predictably, Israel neutralizes the incident by treating it as an exception to its habitual practice. Israel prides itself with having the most moral army. Its police form is cut of the same cloth. But perhaps more important, it uses this error of judgment to produce a phantasmatic image of the Palestinian. Nir Hassan perceptively notes, Ayat Halak is a convenient case, too convenient. His helplessness, his nature as a child in a man's body, managed to allow the public to see him in his humanity. Unlike Halak, Israelis do distinguish between Jews and Arabs. Only when the victim is sufficiently helpless so as to completely dismiss any possibility that he harbored malicious intentions are they viewed beyond their national category. It's the justified outcry in Alag's case that underscores the roaring silence in all the others. Unquote. The humanity of Palestinians discloses itself, or rather is imputed to them by Western eyes, only when their docility is assured. We might say that Alag's humanity is retroactively granted, involving a kind of double negation, a non-humanity, which is never truly identical to humanity as such. Saidiya Hartman critiques this type of identificatory impulse. Only if I can see myself in that position can I understand the crisis of that position, among white liberals when it comes to the victims of anti-blackness. Such a phantasmatic, narcissistic identification becomes a precondition for white liberal outrage. That is the logic of the moral and political discourses we see every day. The need for the innocent black subject to be victimized by a racist state in order to see the racism of the racist state. For racialized bodies to be seen as innocent, they have to be emptied out and libidinally rewritten as white bodies, cleansed of his Palestinianness, and thus depoliticized. Alag is no longer marked as a phobic object, the inhuman stain the Israeli police imagined him to be. His innocence is ironically secured now that he is dead, rendered an absolute victim, and alchemically turned white. A human Palestinian is a dead, whitened Palestinian. If political Zionists and right-wing nationalists are undisturbed by Israel's rule of force, Palestinophobia, and shamelessly continue to engage in fear-mongering by casting Arab Israelis, Palestinians as enemies from within and without, endlessly peddling in Orientalist stereotypes, liberal Zionists disavow this reality and ignore the state's racial practices whenever they insist that they want peace with the Palestinians in exchange for nonviolence. We're tired of air raids, please no more rockets into Israel, no more Gaza wars, goes their public plea to the other side. Liberal Zionists feel ashamed and cringe when they hear the ultranationalist Ayelet Shaked speak about Palestinians in genocidal terms. As former Justice Minister, Shaked infamously endorsed the perspective that Palestinian mothers and children are fair game in the defense of Israel, favorably quoting on her Facebook page the late Uri Elitzur, a speechwriter and advisor to Netanyahu. Quote, "They are all enemy combatants, and their blood shall be on all their heads. Now this also includes the mothers of the martyrs, who sent them to hell with flowers and kisses. They should follow their sons. Nothing would be more just. They should go, as should the physical homes in which they raised the snakes. Otherwise, more little snakes will be raised there." Unquote. For liberal Zionists, Shaked becomes the face of the intolerant, authoritarian Zionist, the excessive racist who doesn't speak for them or their Israel. But this moral reaction creates a distinction without substance. In practice, liberal Zionists actually enjoy and benefit from Shaked's brazen Palestinophobia. She distracts from their complicity with the settler system, from their shared practice of altrucide. The constitution of the Palestinian not as similar to oneself, but as a menacing object from which one must be protected or escape, or which must simply be destroyed if it cannot be subdued. Liberal Zionists purport to be different. When you think of Israel, identify with us, not Shaked, since they are not after a greater Israel. They are anti-settlements, and their endorsements of the two-state solution signals that they are not racist or even settlers, since settler colonialism belongs to the past. Modern Israel is different. Its citizens, on the whole, are not allergic to Palestinians, etc. In fact, liberal Zionists assure Western powers that Israel wants peace. But what kind of peace do they really want? It is a peace understood as the absence of disruptions, the suspension of anti colonial struggle, armed or otherwise. It is a form of peace that serves the interests of the occupiers and their staunch supporters because a peaceful condition obfuscates the non spectacular reality of the occupation. It distracts from the numbering hyperregulation governing Palestinian mobility, as Sari Makdisi describes it. Matched with the life draining reality of curfews, checkpoints, roadblocks, ditches, walls, fences, closures, whose very randomness helps keep Palestinians off balance. Signaling Jewish liberalism, a purported openness to the indigenous other, illustrates what Tuck and Young describe as settler moves to innocence. Those strategies or positionings that attempt to relieve the settler of feelings of guilt or responsibility without giving up land or power or privilege, without having to change much at all. Unquote. Liberal, woke Zionists feel absolved of any responsibility for state violence, terror. They can go on ignoring the debased condition of everyday Palestinians, willfully oblivious to what is happening to the natives when nothing spectacular is happening. Worse, this move gives liberal Zionists a surplus enjoyment in hating the haters, which also casts them as good for feeling bad, while narrowing what is objectionable about Jewish exceptionalism. Edward Said rightly challenged the validity of the distinction between liberal and political Zionisms, between dovish and militaristic Zionisms. The former's views are routinely aired in the Western media as representative of the peace camp. This is Edward Said, quote, and do a brilliant job of concealing their real views of Palestinians, not so different from Likuds, beneath a carpet of conscience-rending, anguished prose, unquote. For liberal Zionists, the Palestinian problem is a 67 problem. The reality of the occupation more or less exhausts what is wrong with Israel. The ethnic cleansing of 1948 is whitewashed, rarely factoring into any form of accountability. Zionism as a settler colonial project, which firmly aligns its leaders and supporters with Western imperial powers, is never acknowledged. Rather, liberal Zionists are keen to underscore how Zionism, at its origin, a democratic project, a nation liberation movement. Jews fleeing anti-Semitism in Europe for a safer and better life in historic Palestine. As victims themselves, they profess sympathy for the Palestinian people. They feel bad about their mistreatment. But this gesture of symmetry, we Israelis and Palestinians are all victims of trauma, is ideologically dubious, a more sophisticated move to innocence, a variant of we are all colonized, which, as Tuck and Young point out, quote, may be a true statement but is deceptively abrasive and vague. Its inference, none of us are settlers, unquote. The peace-loving guise of liberal Zionists protects them from the label of settlers. They want justice without justice. They want peace without sacrificing Jewish privilege. That is, without confronting its racist and hierarchical logic. They want change, better treatment of Palestinians, without actual change. Don't ask me to give up power, accept the right of return, renounce my Jewish privilege, and de-Zionize Israel. Liberal Zionists don't want to see themselves on the wrong side of history, supporting a state that is in the process of losing its global legitimacy. As Theodora Todorova notes, this avowal is one of the key characteristics of settler psychology, unquote. But liberal Zionists, of course, know about Palestinophobia. They are quite cognizant of institutional racism, that Palestinians, Arabs as a class are systematically racialized, demonized, and neglected by the Jewish state. But they act as though they did not know that anti-Palestinian prejudice and discrimination structure and give coherence to the Jewish state, a state that must perpetually wage a demographic war to maintain and protect its Jewish majority, especially from the Palestinian right of return. In their everyday mode of existence, liberal Zionists believe that the problem lies squarely in the visible violence, in the type of violence that interrupts the socio-economic order, the habitual routine of Israeli Jews. The absence of flare-ups with Hamas animates and sustains the belief in Israel's legitimacy. It justifies pride in the nation, that is, in the idea of a pristine democratic Jewish state. This understanding of the conflict, sustained by fetishist disavowal or willful amnesia, resolves the inconsistencies of liberal Zionists and keeps Palestinians in their subordinate place. Woke Zionism leaves unquestioned the ubiquitous, life draining, and naturalized violence of the repressive occupation and the colonial settler framework that underpins it, unacknowledging in turn the full terror and implications of the ongoing, unmattering, and social death of Palestinians. Unsettling the settler's house or the anti colonial fight for recognition. The liberal approach to Palestinian indigeneity fails to change the coordinates of the occupation. Worse, its intervention reinforces rather than alleviates the socio-economic and cultural domination of Palestinians. The liberal attitude coexists with Zionist consciousness of Palestinian indigeneity. And for this reason, the liberal script has been disastrous for Palestinians, freezing them in a state of subaltern humanity. With Palestinian consciousness of Palestinian indigeneity, a new optic emerges. Standing in front of the Zionist Western gaze, the Palestinian asks, "Am I in truth what people say I am?" We shift from the reasoning about Palestinians to the reasoning of Palestinians. If the reasoning about Palestinians produces the indigenous population as primitive, anti-Semitic, and violent, and whose violence is condemned as illegitimate and irrational, the reasoning of Palestinians contests the framing of resistance, self-defense, returning fire, as a series of hateful terrorist acts. The former considers anything short of absolute compliance a threat, a provocation. The latter adopts an anti-colonial vantage point. Zionist settler colonialism is the problem. And Palestinian violence is deemed by no means irrational, but a form of resistance to domination, a stubborn survival strategy in the face of colonial erasure, the incessant Zionist desire to transform Palestinians into a vanished or vanishing people. Reclaiming Palestinian violence also jams the Western liberal framework that makes a recognition of Palestinian humanity contingent on the colonized unconditional embrace of non-violence. As Jamil Kader recalls, this Western demand is not unproblematic because, quote, "the right to resist an occupying force is enshrined in international law," unquote. Liberals may be enamored with the ethics of nonviolence, but living under settler colonialism impacts your options of resistance so that at times the path of nonviolence appears less as a valiant moral stance than a narcissistic liberal privilege, the privilege of choosing nonviolence over violence. The natives' unqualified claims to humanity and nonviolence will never dismantle the settler's house. Indigenous reason returns us again to the settler colonial situation. To paraphrase Max Horkheimer, whoever is not willing to talk about settler colonialism should also keep quiet about armed struggle. Those who are not willing to talk critically about Israel's egregious policies of dispossession should also keep quiet about the form that Palestinian resistance takes. From the vantage point of anti-colonialism, Palestinian violence is both a bold message of non-compliance and an inventive source of psychic replenishment, a view of rehumanization that eschews moralization. As Fanon pointedly observes, at the individual level, violence is a cleansing force. It rids the colonized of their inferiority complex, of their passive and despairing attitude. It emboldens them and restores their self-confidence, unquote. This is why, as Lara Sheehy and Stephen Sheehy note, we should not collapse the violence of the occupied with that of the occupier. Quote, "Equating the violence of the Israeli state with violence as a means of liberation is an unethical equivocation that erases the difference in conditions between the colonizer and the colonized, settler and native," unquote. Palestinian consciousness is through and through combative. It yearns to remedy colonial devastation and rehabilitate the image of the native beyond its designation as infrahuman. Indigenous reason, with or without armed struggle, is an ontological reset. It constitutes a declaration of identity, an identity at odds with the Western Zionist one imputed to Palestinian people. As Edward Said pointed out, Zionism looks quite different when the perspective shifts to its victims, when Palestinians are no longer narrated but become the narrators of their tragic history. Claiming Palestinian indigeneity announces and enacts their permission to narrate, to reframe the ways in which they have been wronged by Israel, whose own permission to narrate, to tell their story of exceptional suffering, has been key in its colonial success, immunizing it from significant critique from Western powers. It allows for a retailing of Zionism's other aspects. Indigenous reason now serves as an antidote to native epistemicide, the silencing of Palestinians, denial of their agency, and barring of their involvement in any hermeneutical endeavor and official knowledge production. The reclaimed visibility of my people, as Palestinian historian and essayist Elias Sambar puts it, exemplifies this mission and desire for a Palestinianness set against a dehumanized image engineered by Zionism. This anti colonial narrative restores native dignity and delivers Palestinians back to humanity. Simply put, the tools of indigenous reason are put in the service of rehumanizing the Palestinian people. Anti colonialism, then, aspires to an alternative humanism, promising a rebirth for Fanon's wretched of the earth. In foregrounding settler colonialism, indigenous reason, the reason of the wretched, contests the colonial order of things, preaches epistemic disobedience, and restages the native Palestinian as a contesting subject, no longer functioning as the screen onto which Western Zionist settler consciousness projects its racist desires and fears about the Orient and Arabs. Quote, the place where writing seeks to exorcise the demon of the first narrative and the structure of subjection within it, the place where writing struggles to evoke, save, activate, and reactualize original experience, tradition, and find the truth of the self no longer outside of the self, but standing on its own ground. Unquote. Palestinian consciousness re-indigenizes the Palestinian people. They were here before the Israeli state. It proceeds to redefine Palestinianness on its own terms by reappropriating Palestinian self-image, untainted by the gaze and judgment of Zionist settlers. This is indeed the other side of indigenous reason. It boldly summons as indigeneity recovered, fashioned in opposition to Zionism's racist assemblages, jamming the social processes that invent and isolate the essential native Palestinian, dwelling outside the green line as infrahuman, expendable, marked for killing or injuring. If Zionist consciousness defaces the native population, disfiguring them as a site or site of abjections, Palestinian consciousness reframes indigeneity as desirable and the locus of agency. It aims to rescue Palestinian humanity, to free Palestinians from their Zionist enclosure. Palestinian citizens of Israel pursue the struggle as a cultural fight for equality, calling for a better biopolitics, better management of their lives. Amal Jamal, for example, stresses the relevance of the category of indigeneity for Israeli Palestinians, quote, because it provides the vocabulary beyond conventional liberal citizenship rights with which they can articulate their demands, unquote. Palestinians in the occupied territories, for their part, strive to survive, to avoid getting killed or maimed by Israel's necropolitics as they struggle to remove the colonizers from the land taken after the Six-Day War in 1967 and to politically reclaim the space for their collective sovereignty. Hamas and the PA struggle in different ways to achieve the same end, a free Palestine. The former engages mostly in the politics of refusal, adopting a hostile attitude towards its occupiers. The latter plays the Western game of diplomacy and maintains security collaboration with the occupying force, abiding by the terms to which the Palestinian leadership agreed in the Oslo Accords, in the cruel hope that Israel will deliver on its part on the Oslo principle of land for peace. Palestinian consciousness of Palestinian indigeneity thus appears split. One narrative fights for the rewards of recognition and equality, while the other yearns for national independence and collective sovereignty. The former operates within an apartheid apparatus, pursuing its reform if not overcoming. The latter adopts a settler colonial framework of analysis, seeking to drive out the occupying presence. But this split distracts from what they have in common. Both imagine native remedy via the logic of the nation state. Recognition of Palestinians within a Jewish state will always, by definition, be qualified. Racial inequality is part and parcel of the Zionist social order. Can the Israeli state be both Jewish and democratic? Indigenous reason here tacitly accepts the idea of a Jewish and democratic Israel. As a democracy, Israel is redeemable. It holds the power to end segregation, internal racism, halt institutional state violence, and be more inclusive by extending full rights to its Arab citizens. Israel can reform itself from within. It must promote Arab assimilation and integration and reverse its apartheid policies, which are doing harm to the idea or ideal of citizenship. Basically, Ending Israel's apartheid logic is good for Jews and Arabs alike. No need for indigenous anti colonial nationalism, then, if indigenous reason can restore dignity and deliver Arab rights, and thus move from separate and unequal to separate but equal, despite what we know of this dubious principle's history in the United States. On a first read, indigenous anti colonial nationalism gets a strong endorsement from Palestinians in the occupied territories. The remedy to Palestinian injury does not operate along the axis of inclusion exclusion. Inclusion is not the answer to the situation of West Bankers, Gazans, and Jerusalemites. Palestinians living under occupation are after true sovereignty, not inclusion or recognition. There is no settler occupation with dignity or a human face. Settler colonialism is the problem, not how it is being managed. As Chickasaw scholar Jody Bird perspicaciously notes, settler narratives of inclusion, the liberal push for a politics of recognition, systematically fail, quote, to grapple with the fact that such discourses further reinscribe the original colonial injury, unquote. The indigenous claim for land repatriation and the liberal fight against racism or anti blackness in the US are fundamentally incommensurable. But here again, Palestinian nationalism, purporting to break from the liberal axis of inclusion exclusion, ironically ends up following a colonial path when it is realized and realizable only in the would-be two-state solution. Palestinians are caught up in the prison house of the nation state. To be sure, the PLO did not naively embrace a two-state solution. Its leaders acknowledged that their concessions were significant, that the two-state solution constituted a great compromise. The late Saab Erekat, who served as Secretary General of the PLO, wrote, "We recognize Israel over 78% of historic Palestine in what has been the most significant concession made by any party in the context of Middle East peace. To embrace a two-state solution on the 1967 border was the Palestinian adoption of an international position." Unquote. An indigenous reason, nurtured by the dream of a time before the settler, that is, a Palestine without Zionist settlers, is willing to limit collective sovereignty to one-third of Palestinians, to those dwelling inside the 67 borders, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, dividing the indigenous people of a future state from both their kin in Israel and refugees whose internationally sanctioned right of return Israel continues to belligerently deny. Haida Aid perceptively calls the two-state solution the opium of the Palestinian people. The two-state solution is not only an ideological drug that distorts Palestinian consciousness of Palestinian indigeneity, it also, and more important, attests to a real suffering. Accordingly, a demystification of the two-state solution is of limited value if the conditions for the suffering are left unaddressed. The two-state solution has been treating symptoms ever since the Oslo process in 1993 by giving Palestinians hope for a better future. But what is needed is a de-Osloization of the Palestinian mind, which would clear the space for a genuine solution to emerge, one that would reorient us to the causes of Palestinian misery and hopelessness, Zionist settler colonialism and Israel's apartheid logic. Such de-Osloization is visible in the Palestinian reaction to the 2021 Gaza war, Operation Guardian of the Walls. The world witnessed an unexpected unity intifada among Palestinians. Frustrated, angry, and defiant Palestinian protesters in Israel proper stood unified in solidarity with their brethren in occupied Palestine against the ongoing Nakba. As Palestinian American Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib reminds us in a pointed tweet, the Nakba never ended. From Jaffa in 1948 to Sheikh Jarrah, Jerusalem today, we must recognize the forced displacement and violent dispossession faced by Palestinians for over 70 years. Unquote. The two-state solution vision of land returned, identity regained leaves additional questions unanswered. Aside from the serious problem of fragmenting its people, the other Palestinians that indigenous reason sidelines, what role do economic structures play in the repatriation, restitution, and rehabilitation of Palestinian indigeneity? Yellowknife's Dean scholar Glenn Coulthard supplements the anti-colonial struggle for land and independence with a strong anti-capitalist sentiment. For indigenous nations to live, capitalism must die. The same holds true for indigenous Palestinians. As Noura Erakat observes, to adequately remedy institutionalized discrimination and subjugation, reformed state institutions should also be imbued with an ethos of socio-economic dignity for all its citizens and residents. Unquote. The fight against capitalism, however, is not undertaken in isolation or withdrawal, but in universalizing the Palestinian plight. Here we have to abandon the classic Marxist category of the proletariat and its exclusive identification with the white working class. To take up the Palestinian question is thus to trouble the traditional subject of the revolution. I agree with Zizek that we have to look elsewhere for revolutionary subjects. A predestined revolutionary subject, as in the days of Marx, is not an option. We need to turn to those who are systematically excluded, disprivileged, and racialized by society's laws and norms, falling outside the liberal and humanist umbrella. They occupy what Zizek dubs a proletarian position. What we have now are different proletarian positions. Quote, it means those people who are deprived of their substance, like ecological victims, psychological victims, and especially excluded victims of racism, and so on. Unquote. This account of the proletarian position jars with Mignolo's decolonial suspicion of the Marxist critique. Quote, class consciousness means a critical consciousness, which, like the one generated by colonial difference and the colonial wound, e.g., critical border thinking, generates in the first case projects of emancipation, and in the second, projects of liberation. However, in the Marxist tradition, the idea of class consciousness hides the fact that the paradigmatic model of the proletarian is white male European. Unquote. If Marxist critical consciousness is still compromised by a latent Eurocentrism, then it not only fails to deliver on its full political potential, but compounds and prolongs the subordination of indigenous and disenfranchised peoples. Zizek's formulation, however, changes the ontological makeup of the proletariat, which is now multiple and precisely at odds with its reduction to white male European subjects. But Mignolo would surely not be satisfied with a mere update regarding who counts as a subject of the revolution if the main target of the critique remains global capitalism as opposed to coloniality, the afterlife of colonialism. A focus on capitalism puts the focus back on modernity and its vaunted legacy. For Mignolo, this critical orientation towards modernity as an unfinished or redeemable project can only keep on reproducing coloniality. The left's championing of communism discards non-European ways of being. Quote, there cannot be only one solution simply because there are many ways of being, which means of thinking and doing. Communism is an option and not an abstract universal. Unquote. Mignolo insists that capitalism is not an unavoidable problem to which communism is the solution, but a Western leftist obsession, and that one can, in fact, fight against the necessity of war, the logic of success and competition which engender corruption and selfishness, and pursue the goals of harmony and the plenitude of life without effectively ending capitalism. But Mignolo's ideals of harmony and plenitude of life, as Zizek rightly notes, are empty abstractions lacking any content and can lend themselves too easily to ideological manipulation, mobilized to obfuscate society's social antagonism. It is also unclear how affirming a non-European way of life or a decolonial project of liberation actually shields you from the tentacles of global capitalism. Neoliberalism is not a Western problem that Palestinians and other non-European communities can simply opt out of. To believe that indigenous peoples can is to peddle the ideological fantasy of a faultless or frictionless world untouched by the evils of capitalism. In any case, occupied Palestine is clearly already feeling neoliberalism's debilitating encroachments. Any genuine alternative to the national frame cannot be seriously entertained without reckoning with the circulation and globalization of capital in Palestine, Israel. To be sure, Marxists have, on the whole, neglected both settler colonialism and racial slavery, treating them as preconditions or historical moments of primitive accumulation in the emergence of capitalism. Against this predominant view of capitalism as unfolding in a linear temporal fashion, Coulthard importantly reorients the Marxist critique back to colonial dispossession, land grabs, extractivism, in order to recast it as an ongoing and urgent problem. Colonial dispossession is a structural problem rather than a series of discrete events that temporarily incite media attention, gaining the status of a spectacle. Dispossession is by no means a relic of the past, nor a minority concern, but intrinsic to racial capitalism and its reproduction, making the life of both indigenous peoples and capitalism inextricably and antagonistically linked. Against Mignolo's decoupling of this link, in a way that would preserve the existence of both indigenous communities free of capitalism and Western capitalism, I want to attend more closely to the ways the former wages its collective struggle against the latter. What Palestinians, other indigenous communities, and black folk have in common is that they occupy a proletarian position, the position of the part of no part. They are the supernumerary elements of their respective societies, those who belong to a situation without having a specific place in it. They are included but have no part to play in the social edifice. Since their interests are not predetermined by their positionality, when these subjects seek to remedy a wrong, inequality for example, they speak to universal concerns. Quote, precisely because Palestinians have been reduced to this undead position in the global capitalist system, Kader notes, Palestinians can be said to represent the truth of the system, its constitutive injustice and inequality. In their inherent exclusion and abjection, therefore, Palestinians can be considered, in Zizek's words, the very site of political universality. Unquote. Indeed, when Said expresses his motto, equality or nothing, he never limits it to the wronged Palestinians alone or fetishized indigenous grievance. The call for egalitarian justice, equality or nothing, is precisely open to all. He follows it, in fact, with for Arabs and Jews. Palestinians must meet the challenges of political justice and not exceptionalize themselves and take refuge in Palestinocentrism. Quote, if one people enjoys a right of return, the other one must also. Otherwise, the conflict continues, in the real interest of no one at all. No one, not even those who seem to be profiting in the short run. Unquote. But indigenous reason, in its practice, is prone to foster racial forms of belonging and to bolster exclusionary and separatist mindsets, quote, to succession from the world, unquote, which ultimately benefit and unwittingly reproduce the settler colonial matrix. In arguing that indigenous Palestinians embody a proletarian position, I propose to recast what Palestinian consciousness of Palestinian indigeneity might look like. The wager. For the struggle of collective freedom to become truly transformative and effectively break with liberal colonial scripts and their authorized social relations, Palestinians cannot content themselves with the phantasmatic and nostalgic lure of an atavistic time before the settler, absent a confrontation with the global economy and racial capitalism, most notably the structural role of anti-blackness in the formation of modernity's human subject and its claims of sovereignty. As a counter to the ideological traps of rootedness and purity, a life prior to or free from the trauma of Zionism, this book reads Palestinian indigeneity dialectically in an effort to dislodge the current impasse between the settler and the native, the Jew and the Palestinian, moving beyond identitarian solutions. To paraphrase Fanon, the white Israeli is locked in his whiteness, the Palestinian in his indigeneity. Whence the need to decolonize the mind and rethink anew Palestinian indigeneity. Decolonizing the mind is not a mere metaphor, symbol, something that should give way to demands for actual material change. Tuck and Young mistakenly downplay the political force of the Fanonian injunction from the wretched of the earth. Quote, Fanon told us in 1963 that decolonizing the mind is the first step, not the only step toward overthrowing colonial regimes. Until stolen land is relinquished, critical consciousness does not translate into action that disrupts settler colonialism. Unquote. This is obviously true. Critical consciousness is, in of itself, insufficient to end settler colonialism. But Tuck and Young go further, repeatedly questioning its importance or emancipatory value by degrading it to a first step among more important ones in the project of decolonization. Fanon would hardly characterize decolonizing the mind a first step, as if once accomplished, the colonized can move to the more serious matter of land repatriation. On the contrary, we might say that decolonizing the mind is indigenous reason at its rigorous best. The self is at war against consciousness, self critical, self violent, and transformative, the latter because of the former. Decolonizing the mind complicates the relationality between the native and the settler, so that the problem of occupation is not only located or embodied in the latter, but in the former as well. First of all, decolonizing the mind registers the degree to which symbolic violence degrades the ontology of the indigenous population. Indeed, it is not at all clear that decolonizing the mind is a metaphor, or if it is a metaphor, it is a metaphor that discloses something about the powers of language and exposes the limits of a liberal anti racist critique that remains at the representational level, believing that words affect thinking but not being itself. In the struggle against racial domination, racist words must be given their full material weight. Words penetrate bodies, they produce abject monsters. This is Hortense Spiller's point in her powerful rewriting of an old schoolyard adage. Okay. Quote, "Sticks and stones might break our bones, but words will most certainly kill us." Unquote. Decolonizing the mind, refusing the settler's symbolic rules and demands, must be understood here as a materialist or ontological project. It is not enough to reject the settler's ways. Excising the colonizer's ideology from the colonized mind and being involves the dialectical and arduous task of undoing what has been done to the native, what has been produced in the native. For this reason, overcoming Israeli anti Arab prejudice and Palestinophobia cannot be achieved by a retreat into one's restored, revived cultural particularity. Though the affective comfort of identity, of feeling at home, ought not to be ignored or underestimated, this culturalization of indigeneity, the territorialization of Palestinianness, always risks prolonging the settlers' essentialization of the natives, homogenizing and sealing the latter in their ethno religious identity. Decolonizing the mind is a vital counter to this temptation of authenticity, symbolized by the racist desire for a Palestine exclusively for the Palestinian people, alongside the equally racist desire for a Jewish state exclusively for the Jewish people, or simply Israel. It is an act of self violence, a self beating of sorts, which begins with the disruption of the natives' affective investments in rooted identity and self identity, and what the settler has enjoyed but systematically denied the indigenous population. Coulthard, following Tayaka Alfred and Leanne Simpson, offers an alternative, and a decidedly non dialectical, relation to one's past, involving doubling down on tradition, recasting it as self conscious traditionalism, and opting to turn away from the assimilative reformism of the liberal recognition and its complicity with capitalism writ large. Culture is an archive and endless source of and for indigenous resurgence. Countering a sanctioned politics of recognition with a politics of refusal might weaken capitalism's hold on indigenous communities, halting its dispossession of land and extractivist logic, and exposing its complicity with the liberal white state, the promise of change without real change. But would it actually bring about its global demise? To recall Coulthard's bold declaration, "For indigenous nations to live, capitalism must die," which he follows with, "For capitalism to die, we must actively participate in the construction of indigenous alternatives to it." Unquote. Yes, but can indigenous nations truly live if capitalism thrives everywhere else in the world, assuming one can even manage to kill it at home via sustainable and self sufficient indigenous economies? Doesn't global capitalism benefit if indigenous communities keep their anti capitalism, their non exploitative alternatives local? Jamming the interests of settler capital, Coulthard's libidinal investment in indigenous practices of the past discloses here the limits of indigenous reason. Psychic investment in these practices is not a priori problematic. They can, of course, be a source of pride or invention, compelling us in an important fashion to think culture with economics, the mode of production as a mode of life, but they are also all too prone to fetishization, locking communities in their anti capitalist indigeneity. To mobilize the Palestinian cause, national belonging, polity, and insurgency itself must be imagined otherwise. Palestinian indigeneity must be both defended, it is not backward, primitive, underdeveloped, etc., and reinvented by infusing it with a diasporic and transnational sensibility. I echo here Fanon's call for a more generous, affective, and identificatory field. I am a man and I have to rework the world's past from the very beginning. I am not just responsible for the slave revolt in Saint Domingue. Every time a man has brought victory to the dignity of the spirit, every time a man has said no to an attempt to enslave his fellow man, I have felt a sense of solidarity with his act. Unquote. Fanon kept his distance from the lures of identity and sameness, always attentive to the wretched cries of injustice. As Bashir Abu Maneh argues, for Fanon, ending racism and exclusion had to be done not through reifying oppressed identities and celebrating national or ethnic particularism, but through common struggle for freedom and equality. Unquote. A care for another ought not to be limited to your putative kin, nor prioritized over and above any other engagements. Palestinian indigeneity is not only what, where you are, a fixed, rooted state of being, it is also what you do, becoming, relationality. Becoming indigenous. Indigeneity as an anti racist assemblage is born out of the sites and processes of struggles that Palestinians in different locations and times are and have been inhabiting. The struggles that Palestinians inhabit are multitude. In this light, to stand in solidarity with the Palestinian cause does not entail an exercise in identitarian identification. If there is an affective call in the Palestinian cause, which I believe there is, it is one that identifies with the Palestinians' emphatic no, that affirms the inscrutable refusal to be subjugated and bears witness to emancipatory force behind this political act of indocility. Indigenous resurgence as such. This staging of the Palestinian cause clears a space for the universal, for political innovation and a reimagining of universality as the possibility for cross-racial revolutionary solidarity, as an emancipatory project of the repressed, the exploited and suffering, the parts of no part of every culture, coming together in a shared struggle. As both a call for indigenous resurgence and an enactment of it, the Palestinian cause manifests itself in unexpected ways and places. The spontaneous support of activists in occupied Palestine for the Black Lives Matter movement, along with BLM's reciprocal gesture, attests to this miraculous impossibility, where politics exceeds any faction's immediate goals. These Palestinians displayed to the world that the Palestinian cause is not limited to Palestinian matters. This Black Palestinian solidarity in the making, this universality in becoming, disrupted and is disrupting a futurology grounded in narcissistic identity politics and the cynical calculation of self-interest. For the Palestinian cause is global or it is not. The chapters that follow make the case that the Palestinian cause, in its incitement to solidarity, is a universal proposition. In Chapter 1, Look, a Palestinian, I explore the Zionist gaze and its devastating impact on Palestinian bodies, analogous but not identical to the experience famously related by Fanon, who describes how the white gaze obliterates his very being, barring him from the category of the human, the subject par excellence, and reducing him to an inert object. To be seen unseen as Palestinian is to be on the receiving end of a racialized colonial logic that determines your presence as an existential threat to Israel and Jewish Israelis. From the Zionist vantage point, being Palestinian is always already a crime, to be guilty of Palestinianness. Palestinian indigeneity is a cause for suspicion and dehumanization. Witness the Israeli military checkpoints, buffer zones, apartheid wall. At the same time, Black studies critics emerging from the Afro-pessimist movement have cautioned against this analogy between blackness and non-black people of color, insisting on their incommensurability. Afro-pessimists warn against the tendency to see a common cause between blacks and Palestinians, as if they are resisting the same thing. They underscore the necessity of sustaining the difference between blacks and Palestinians, not only because it is wrong to collapse the two different histories, different enemies, but also because it obfuscates a consideration of conscious and unconscious Palestinian anti-blackness. Against Afro-pessimism's Manichaean reason, which insists on the black-non-black divide, the chapter argues that what jams the gaze of Jewish supremacy is not an intervention that serves to promote a zero sum approach to the struggle against racial injustice, indigeneity, or blackness, two competing narratives of social death. No, the challenge is to see how indigeneity and blackness are both ensnared in a multifaceted matrix of racialization. The fate of one is invariably dependent on that of the other. Chapter 2, Thinking Under Occupation, delves into the challenges of innovation when Palestinians are silenced, denied agency, and excluded from knowledge production, when, that is, they are cast as the known, not the knowers. Decoloniality, in its endeavor to empower native cultures and make indigenous knowledges visible, relevant, and comprehensible, seems well poised to speak to Palestinians' needs and desires, safeguarding their indigeneity against Israel's hegemonic narratives. Decoloniality rightly casts Zionism as complicit with the dark side of modernity, aligning it with coloniality and the racial domination of non Europeans. This chapter takes up Mignolo's decolonial thesis, I am where I think, which significantly departs from Descartes' abstract formulation, I think therefore I am, and assesses its appeal, relevance, and ultimately limits for understanding Palestinian identity. Decoloniality lays out a path forward for indigenous Palestinians. The imperative is to delink from coloniality and reconstitute or relink to pre colonial ways of thinking and living. And yet, decoloniality's response to the Palestinian question tends to fetishize the local, to homogenize and romanticize the natives' pre colonial roots. It imagines the spaces of indigeneity as untouched by coloniality, conceiving of a Palestinian identity freed from Zionist enclosure. Against decoloniality's nativist, pensioned, and frictionless account of indigenous identity community, I turn to the notion of exile, as elaborated by Edward Said and Mourid Barghouti. Thinking indigeneity with exile and vice versa, to conceive of them contrapuntally, is a way to resist the lures of both rootedness and abstraction. Chapter 3, Ressentiment, Paranoia, situates the effect of ressentiment and the mood or orientation of paranoia in the material reality of the occupation. I do so in order to decouple Zionism's ideological pairing of resentment and paranoia with anti Semitism. If the Zionist script constantly casts resentment and paranoia as defects of the Palestinian mind, I try to map an alternative meaning for both terms. In exploring Palestinian resentment, I first turn to Elias Suleiman's Divine Intervention, which stages Palestinian communities as full of friction and resentment coming not only from without, living under the occupation, but also from within, living with fellow Palestinians. While Suleiman puts on full display the sickness of Palestinian communities, how the collective indigenous body is striking at itself, how Palestinians are striking at their kin, Divine Intervention's magical moments recast Palestinians as striking at their occupiers. Palestinian resentment breaks from its containment as an exclusively bitter affect, becoming the ground for what I call the public use of resentment, akin to Kant's public use of reason. The public use of resentment transmutes the existential suffering of Palestinians, transforming it into a collective moral feeling founded on the shared but unacceptable condition of exclusion and dispossession. The public of resentment situates this affect not within the personal realm of blame and hatred, but the public sphere of anger and politics. Next, I take up the possibility of an anti Zionist hermeneutic that short circuits the Zionist machinery, reducing Palestinian paranoia to a manifestation of the eternal hatred of Jews. As a case study, I examine the so called controversy regarding Jasbir Puar's talk at Vassar College about her ethnographic research in the West Bank. A remark that some West Bankers believed that the Israeli government harvested Palestinian organs became a lightning rod, despite government officials' acknowledgement that the practice in question happened in the recent past. Some critics manufactured outrage, quickly accusing Puar of recycling and disseminating blood libel and manipulatively tying the anti Semitism of the left to a narrow and ideological loaded understanding of Palestinian paranoia. In Chapter 4, Sovereignty, crossed out or under erasure, I address the desire for collective or national sovereignty that fuels the Palestinian struggle against settler colonialism. The return of land would, in principle, signal the end of the settler colonial regime and the start of self determination. In the contemporary scene, the idea of the two state solution continues to enjoy wide support among Western powers, Arab neighbors, liberal Zionists, and the PA itself. Palestinian sovereignty appears exclusively legible through the paradigm of the two state solution. But critics and activists have declared the solution both impossible and undesirable. The former because of the ongoing land grab by the Israeli government, the latter because it feeds a racist vision, a partition of the land based on ethno nationalist investments. This chapter first critically unpacks the ideological appeal and the effective spell of the two state solution, captured in Bartlett Sher's film Oslo, which creates nostalgia for the Oslo Accords and the peace process. It then turns to Larissa Sansour's science fiction short film Nation Estate for its staging of a dystopian and hopeless rendering of the two state solution. Next, I take up binationalism as an ethico political project that undertakes to imagine sovereignty differently. If the concept of sovereignty serves both as a reminder of sovereignty's damning colonial genealogy and as a warning against Palestine's ongoing complicity with neoliberalism's insatiable and perverse logic, which instrumentalizes humans and deprives them of their rights and protection, engendering, in turn, a new class of slaves, sovereignty, crossed out, interrogates its relation to the category of the human and underscores the intricate labor of decolonization and abolition.